Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm here to help you make the most of your mineral rights and royalties. I'm really excited about this week's episode because we have two very interesting guests lined up for you. Kyle Chambers and Joey Falbo with Texas Quality Assurance LLC joined Justin and I to teach us about quality management and why everyone needs to know what it is. And in fact, Kyle and his wife, Darci, host a podcast called Quality Matters, where they talk about quality management and ways to make your life easier at work and home. This was a really interesting conversation as we dove deep into how quality management is really important in the oil field, and especially when drilling a well. Joey tells a few stories from his experience working in the field around things like inspecting drilling equipment, and why this is so critical in making sure a well is drilled safely and on time. So be sure to listen to the end to learn about the types of things that operators and drilling contractors have to do in order to make sure that everything goes well, and no pun intended, when they drill the well. This is important to us as mineral owners because if the operator has an equipment failure that causes them to have to plug the well, it may never get repaired or completed if it's not cost effective to do so. And so, as you know, if a well doesn't produce oil and gas, of course, we don't get paid royalties. So this all ties back to all the stuff that goes into drilling a well in the field and kind of gives you a little bit of behind the scenes as to some of the inspections and critical safety things that they have to think about. And at the very end, we also talk about what it's like to work in the Permian Basin and some of the amazing opportunities that are presented. So let me tell you a little bit about our guests before we dive in. Kyle Chambers is the driving force behind the Quality Matters podcast, like I mentioned earlier, and he's the founder and CEO of Texas Quality Assurance. Kyle has an extensive background in quality, health and safety, environmental management, as well as auditing, consulting, and software development. The mission of the Quality Matters podcast is to save folks time and energy for what matters most. And the fact is, quality management is so often gets in the way of us doing our best and being our best. So definitely recommend that you check out the podcast, even if you aren't in the middle of a quality management system implementation, because they have some really interesting stories. They interview some really interesting people. In fact, I was honored to appear in episode 70 of the Quality Matters podcast to talk about my experiences at Shell and why quality and continuous improvement is so important right now in the oil and gas industry. So if you want to hear more about my background and some of the projects that I worked on and some of the interesting stuff that I ran into at the last assignment that I had while I was there, definitely check that out. You can find it wherever you get your podcast or at qmcast.com. And our other guest is Joey Falbo, who is the Quality Management System Sales Guide at Texas Quality Assurance. And he has 14 years in the oil and gas industry and has held roles of field technician, project manager, sales representative, and operations manager. And during his time in the field, he managed a number of projects from maintenance inspections to highly critical drilling programs, which we talk about. And prior to this, he worked as an ASNT Level 2 inspector focused on the thorough inspection of oil field equipment. So without further ado, please welcome my guests, Kyle Chambers and Joey Falbo with the Quality Matters podcast and Texas Quality Assurance LLC. Welcome, Kyle and Joey. Thanks again for coming on the Mineral Rights Podcast. How are you guys doing today?
Oh, just fine.
Doing great. I appreciate you having us, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. And Justin's here as well. Hey, Justin.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Kyle and Joey. Glad to have you guys.
So we're going to do something a little bit different here and kind of branch out from the topic of strictly minerals and royalties and give you guys a little bit of a perspective as to what goes on in the field when a drilling rig shows up on site. What are all the details that go into drilling that well? But before we do that, I would love to have our guests, Kyle and Joey from Texas Quality Assurance, introduce themselves. So, Kyle, you want to go ahead and talk about kind of how you got started and what led you to start Texas Quality Assurance and what do you guys do?
Yeah, so kind of precariously, I was a systems administrator. I have an IT background, and so my education, all the formal training originally was, but small company. It was in the energy world, the gas turbine world, and so where a lot of the natural gas gets put to use. And loved the company, but I'd really run out of work to do, and I was afraid of losing my job, so I started poking around for something else to do, and so finally they tossed health and safety at me, and didn't really have a clue about any of it. Didn't know who OSHA was or nothing, but kind of dug into it, and that led into environmental management, quality management, and next thing you know, we're going for a certification for quality for 9001, for environmental management for 14001, and for health and safety management for 18,001. And in the process of doing so, I realized very quickly how many inefficiencies exist day to day in managing our processes, right? Managing your day to day production, managing the paperwork on the back end. And so I started developing some software tools to make improvements for myself. And word got out about some of the things that I'd done, and one thing led to another, and I'm developing servers on my kitchen table. And then 2016 decided that it'd be a good idea to do this as a full-time basis. So we do software consultations, auditing, training, you name it. If it's in the quality or compliance world, we'll handle it.
Very cool. And it sounds like you have a bit of an oil and gas background. Are most of your customers in oil and gas industry, or kind of what are some of the industries you serve?
It's probably about 50% oil and gas, and after that, it's almost all over the place. From small electronics, we're trying to get involved in the medical device space right now, so it's really all over the place. But about half of it's oil and gas, and heck, Joey and I have been working the last couple of days trying to put a project together for developing some weld specs for a client of ours out in Midland, Odessa.
Cool. Yeah. And so you guys are in Houston, right? That's the headquarters of Texas QA.
Technically Pearland, but it's all Houston as far as the eye can see.
Yep. Yep. No, I'm familiar with that part of the world, and yep. So the Houston metro area, we'll call it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It sprawls forever.
Joey, do you want to talk a little bit about your background and what brought you to Texas Quality Assurance?
Sure. So it's a pretty fluid event that happened to lead me to Texas Quality Assurance. I started doing non-destructive testing on drilling tubulars, and that was really my opening to the oil and gas. So when these guys are drilling, they're drilling with tubulars that experience a lot of stress, a lot of fatigue. And so there's a point in the process which these tools have to be inspected. And that was my job. I did that for about 4 years. And that led me to another role, which is kind of you hear it called two different things. It's third party or second party. So the operators who own the leases and are paying to drill these wells hire somebody like what I was doing to oversee their drilling quality program. And so what we would do is we would get dispatched to various shops who service tools, as well as to the rig to monitor inspections, monitor drilling activities such as make and break of connections, because there really is a lot that goes into it. But through my time there, I did that for about 10 years. I would go into these shops and you would be able to see these gaps, but you weren't able to address them very well because you were there on behalf of the client. So there didn't need to be, but sometimes there was this adversarial relationship going on. But I knew that I could help these guys. And so that kind of led me to Texas Quality Assurance because that's what they do. They're helping these vendors, these suppliers of tools and equipment to the operators establish a quality program to where they don't have issues on the rig. And if they do have issues, they have a very solid method of figuring out what the root cause was and correcting it.
Perfect. Now that makes sense. I know there's a lot of things that go into drilling a well, and we'll get into that in a minute. But one of the things I'd love to talk about a little bit before we do is just talk about quality management. And when you guys have mentioned it and kind of alluded to it and talked about a few sort of examples, but what is quality management for our listeners who may not be familiar with the term?
It is a weird term because it's one of these things that just kind of gets thrown around and overused, and quality has become a bit of a buzzword itself. But effectively, quality can be at any level. And so, use an example: if you buy a box of pencils, right? So, I got kids that are in school. If we buy a box of pencils, if one of the pencils is sharpened, pre-sharpened, and none of the others are, I would argue that's not high quality because I'm expecting either a box of fully sharpened pencils or a box of unsharpened pencils. And so it's the level to which you can meet expectations and requirements. That's quality. And it's kind of buy something on Amazon that cost $5 and the next product in line costs 30 or 40. You may not have a high expectation of that product working well. And so you could argue that low quality because it's not going to meet the desired expectations. And that's really it. And so quality management is how we go about identifying what those requirements are, identifying what those expectations are, and then setting up processes to achieve them. And as Joey just said, when we don't achieve them, to put corrective actions in place to identify the root cause and make sure it never happens again.
And so it sounds like quality is probably applicable to every industry. So no matter what you do or what you buy, some level of quality management goes into that product or service. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. Quality is everywhere.
Yeah. And before we started talking, you gave an example of some of the standards. I know that driving down the highway, I've seen the ISO 9001 certification. What does that mean for people that are, see a box truck that has that stamped on the back, or driving by a manufacturing facility that has that on their sign?
Yeah, so to get your ISO 9001 certification, and this would apply as well for a lot of the folks in the oil field as well, you'll see API Q1 and whatnot. It's a standard. And so it is a list of requirements, right? So we talk about quality meeting those requirements and those expectations. So ISO 9001 is a document that states these are minimum expectations that you have of how you handle your suppliers, how you handle calibrations, training, documented information, all those documents, procedures, and records you got. How are you going to keep all that together? So to be certified, you have to get a third-party company to provide what's called a certification audit. And that certification audit is they come in and either you're meeting the requirements, you're not meeting the requirements. And Texas Quality Assurance, we kind of jump in the middle because we help you get ready for that audit. Then we help you out after that audit. But that's what the certification means, is that someone has done an independent, in-depth, intense review to say these folks are meeting their customer requirements, their industry requirements, and the requirements of this standard.
And so it sounds like there's a bit of a compliance element to it. And I guess in some industries, it's sort of compulsory and you have to follow that. But I mean, is there more like just generically a bottom line impact? I mean, is it quality management, a successful implementation of quality management? Do you see an impact on the bottom line for your customers?
Almost every time you're going to be looking at anywhere from 20, 30, 40% in cost savings. And it depends on kind of the starting point of the organization before they started to implement a system. But it is mind-boggling how many tons of paper folks go through, the countless hours that they utilize working these processes. We had one client, their corrective action form had 46 fields on it, and it would take hours just to fill out the form. And so what wound up happening is no one filled it out. And so if no one's filling it out, no one's correcting problems. We've all had this situation where you're in the office, you're in the field, wherever it is that you're working, right? And you are frustrated with all get out because you keep running into the same problem over and over and over. And we've all said it, why won't somebody fix it? Well, a good quality management system provides the opportunity and means and motivation for somebody to fix it.
That makes sense. And I'm really familiar with the continuous improvement elements like lean and some of the other methodologies. How do these two systems overlap, or is it sort of elements of lean and continuous improvement that are embedded in a good quality management system? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this is where sometimes I get some dirty looks from folks. We'll come in talking about quality management. That's immediately where their mind goes, is their mind immediately jumps to the idea of lean and Six Sigma. And unfortunately, it's gotten a little bit of a bad reputation because the first thing you think about that is all of these various belt levels, very expensive third-party folks coming in doing multi-day consultation work and math galore that most folks don't understand. But that's not the essence of what it is. The essence is to find waste, right? To find the little nuances of how we can improve things, how can we do a better job to check things. And that's where the overlap in the quality management system is. So an ISO 9001 certified company is not necessarily super efficient, but they are very good at meeting requirements. Whereas a company that's gone through a lot of work with continuous improvement with these lean initiatives and Six Sigma initiatives, they are very good at eliminating waste, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have this extensive, robust program to identify all of the potential requirements that are out there. So they kind of hit two sides of the same problem.
No, that makes sense. So in its essence, very similar, it sounds like. I'll switch gears a little bit before we talk about Joey's oil field experience. And I want you to give us a little bit of a taste for your podcast. So that's one of the other things that our listeners may not know is you're also the co-host of the Quality Matters podcast with your wife, Darci. Can you talk a little bit about what you guys do on that show?
Oh, yeah. So the podcast is just an absolute blast. The title really says it all. Quality matters. And it's because quality truly matters. And it just does not matter where you go. We kind of already talked about that at the beginning of this episode here. Is if you take a look at the podcast, we talk about everything from education of school districts that have gotten certified, the medical world, Toyota. I mean, you name it, it's there. So it really doesn't matter where you go. This idea of quality management, it just matters in every industry because everyone's got requirements and we all want to make our customer happy.
Absolutely.
And so we've been doing this now for, I guess, about a year, a little year and a half now. So I think actually the episode you were just on made episode 70.
70. Yeah, that was a fun conversation. So for any of our listeners that want to hear me talk about my experiences and the importance of quality and continuous improvement in the oil and gas industry, definitely check that out. And you can find that, I assume, wherever you find your podcasts, as well
So,
as
Joey,
at
now our listeners, they
qmcast.com.
include
Is
lots
that
of
right?
industry
Yes,
professionals
sir.
and those
That's it.
surrounding the oil and gas,
Definitely
maybe
give it a
mineral rights,
listen. Let me
royalty
know what you
space.
think.
But we
Everybody
also
can
have a
benefit
lot
from
that
this no matter what
aren't in the
industry you're in.
industry.
So check them
For the
out.
listeners
They're a
that
great
aren't in the
resource.
industry,
So,
can we take
Cool,
a bit
thank
of
you.
a deeper dive into your experiences working into the field?
Well, I sure can, and there's quite a bit that goes into it that even I didn't realize in my beginning years in the oil and gas. But there is a lot of equipment associated with drilling. You have various size holes that you're drilling, so you have various size equipment that you're drilling. You have a lot of different people involved in that, from people transporting the equipment to people servicing the equipment, people inspecting and repairing the equipment, to people on the rig actually drilling with the equipment. So it's pretty labor intensive, and there's just so many different things going on. And so, some of the experience I have in the oil and gas is the level of inspections that are required for this. I mean, this stuff is going miles down and then miles, horizontally. And you could imagine the kind of stress that this metal is going under, and it's incredible. And not only it's spinning, so there's cyclic stress there as well. So it's a pretty incredible process. And the inspection aspect, almost everything used in the drilling process gets inspected at some level. And that's always been my experience and my involvement in it is either performing the inspections and or developing inspection programs to highlight levels of inspection and frequencies of inspection based on expected well conditions or what was actually experienced. So if you're going into a well and you know it's going to be a critical well, you set up processes beforehand to say, okay, listen, we're going to have this much load. We're going to be going this far in the hole. There's going to be this much heat. We need to make sure that our equipment meets a certain level of quality. And then there's also the reverse end of that, where you didn't expect to have some of the well conditions that you end up running into. And now you need to make sure that, is my drilling equipment still okay to use in the future? Because maybe we had to pull too hard, or maybe it saw some vibrations that you didn't expect to see. And so you need to evaluate your equipment. But there's just so many different levels too. I mean, there's inspections happening out on the rig site very regularly. All the equipment that gets sent to the various shops around the United States who service that, I mean, they are all inspecting this as well. And so my involvement with that too has been realizing that there are so many different variables that remain uncontrolled. And that was part of my job, was to try to place controls on behalf of the operator to standardize equipment and make sure that the equipment received was the equipment that they actually need and will be able to use. And that's very similar to what we're doing now at Texas Quality Assurance as well. Helping vendors out who supply drilling equipment establish quality programs so they know that they can meet the
and I think
requirements set
quality is
forth by
something
the
that
operator.
people don't think
So
about a
if
lot when
they're
it comes to
drilling in
oil
these
and gas and
conditions,
being out in the field.
we know that the
What
equipment
are
will
some of
be
the
able
common
to
safety issues
meet
that
and
you
or
saw,
exceed
or
those
some of the
conditions
concerns that came up from a
without
quality
failing.
standpoint that were kind of common in the field?
Some of the things, it comes down to not having programs established. So, okay, you want to talk about safety. We have elevators that are holding hundreds of thousands of pounds. And if you don't have a proper inspection program in place, you can drop your string pretty easily through damage or through not having the right type of equipment to meet your tubular size or whatnot. So I've definitely seen that, to where you can put yourself in a tricky situation. And if you drop your string, I mean, you've pretty much ruined that well. It's going to take some significant fishing and time and money and effort to get that string back out of the hole. So that's one of them. The other thing that I've seen quite a bit is a lack of quality programs that lead to ruining your well. Not having a good inspection program in place to where you completely omit a certain inspection, and you're drilling with this equipment because it passed inspection, but you didn't have the right inspections in place to identify a certain point of failure. And then you're drilling
Absolutely.
away, and all
I'm
of a
sure there's some
sudden,
very unhappy people in
your
those
pipe breaks in
situations.
half and it
What are
drops
some
in
of
the
the
well,
tests
and
that you
nobody has
see
any
running the
idea what
equipment on
happened
the
or
rig
why
and
it
in the
happened.
field? I mean,
Those
maybe
are
these
some
are
pretty
preventing
common
issues
things
they're talking about.
that you run across in the industry for sure. Oh man, that is a fun topic, because especially with the enhancement of technology through the times, inspection has kind of followed along with it. But there's some really awesome procedures that are pretty fun to learn about and interesting to hear about. So some of those is magnetic particle inspection. It's a pretty interesting process. A lot of people may remember, it might be early high school, middle school, where you wrap a wire around a nail and you hook the wire up to a 9-volt battery, and all of a sudden that nail becomes a magnet and it can hold paper clips and whatnot. It's the exact same process that we do out in the field on this equipment, because most of the equipment is ferromagnetics tools, so it's standard steel, so it can all be magnetized. And through that process, you're actually able to find defects in the steel that are open to the surface. So let's take, for instance, a piece of drill pipe. You have the tube as well as you have a connection, and that connection is what connects each joint of pipe through the entire string, which could be made up of hundreds of joints of pipe. I mean, 600 joints, 300 joints. And each of those connections are a point of failure. So you have to thoroughly inspect those, because they do crack from the stresses. And so it's pretty neat, because you use a black light and you magnetize the piece, and you have this fluorescent particle suspended in a solution, typically mineral spirits or water, and you spray it on the component, the metal component, while it's being magnetized. And if you take a black light to it, you'll actually see the crack very, very clearly. Now, granted, you have to have a cape over you because you can't do this in daylight, but it's a very interesting process. So that's one of them that I've always liked. And Electromagnetic inspection is another one. So it's a pretty neat process on drill pipe where you have your tube. There's this little buggy that's computerized and automated, and it runs from one end of the piece of pipe to the other end of the piece of pipe, and it will tell you as well if there is any significant wall reductions from fluid being passed through the center of these drill pipe to any sort of fatigue cracks that may be presenting themselves from the stress. But there's inspection happening all throughout. So there's inspections. So even drilling, when you're pulling some of this pipe out of the hole, and they disconnect a connection, there's people out there that clean that connection, take a look at the threads and the shoulder to see, if there's any imperfections, any damage to the threads. Because what you can imagine, it's like a bolt and going into a nut, right? There's threads on both ends. One is like a female and one is a male end. And if there's damage to those connections, those can pose problems because they actually make a seal, and sometimes they're torqued up to 25,000
I think you
torque.
mentioned it well, but no matter how good the
although
manufacturing is,
they're pieces of pipe,
continually
they're pieces of
inspecting those
steel,
products to
there's a
be
lot
sure
of
of the wear and
engineering that's
tear
gone into
is something that
them,
people
thus
just don't even
requires
realize
a
is
lot of
going
inspection.
on. And not only for the equipment to keep tools from breaking, but also for safety to be sure everybody is safe and anything that they're doing is safe. All right, so the nuts and bolts. When something does fail, root cause analysis. What goes into figuring out why and then preventing it from happening again? Is this something in the field? How far does this go? Where does it land?
From my experience, this can be a pretty involved process, and it does. It involves field personnel, it involves drilling engineers and various engineers, quality engineers within the operator, within the drilling contractor. So it's pretty detailed, and it starts in the field. So if you have a failure in the field, I mean, you have to look at the point of failure. So you have folks, superintendents, drilling hands, taking a look to see what happened. And then there's also folks in the office reviewing operations. Okay, what happened at the point of failure? Were we doing something maybe we shouldn't have? You're driving your car, right? If you redline your car long enough, your engine's going to fail. So could have they been redlining the drilling equipment? So there's a lot that goes into it. There's destructive testing. So well, if it's not an operational issue, could it have been an inherent metallurgical issue? An issue that was found or that was not found during the manufacturing process. So there's loads that go into it, and they even hire companies to come in and do failure investigations, and that's what they do. So they're taking pictures, they're taking measurements, they're looking at the point of failure, they're thoroughly reviewing operations as well as doing the non-destructive and the destructive testing to see if there's anything else that goes on. And kind of the quality management aspect of that is once they do find out what's going on, and let's say it is a manufacturing issue, then, well, now they know that they can go to that manufacturer and say, hey, listen, this is what happened. How can we, or what can we do to prevent this? If it's a drilling operational issue, it's going back to the drilling team and to the drilling contractor and saying, okay,
Absolutely.
this is what's
and kind of
happened
follow the
and we're
money.
experiencing
When these things
failures.
happen,
So
especially in oil
what
and
can
gas,
we do
the cost
to
for this
draw
can just be
back, or
enormous.
what can we
So I'm sure a
modify
big part
within
of
our
it is trying to
procedure
figure out
to
so that
prevent
there's
this
no money
equipment
wasted in the
failure?
future.
That is definitely a big issue, and it's definitely operator driven in that sense because they are the ones that really take the hit on that. Because drilling nowadays, I mean, these guys they're punching wells pretty quick. I mean, you're talking about 2 weeks, and you're able to complete a well. But if you do have a point of failure and it takes you 5 days, 6 days to remedy that issue, well, not only have you spent 5 days, which is a lot of money just in rig costs alone, not including equipment costs and other operating costs. You have 5 more days
Absolutely.
now to
And this might
complete
be a
that
loaded
well than
question,
have
but
been
what is
expected.
the most
So
interesting
there's,
failure
every
investigation
failure
that
for
you've
however
worked
many
on?
days, really you're doubling that in costs. So the financial impact is very big. That's a good one. Well, I've been a part of a few, and I think some of the most interesting ones, so it wasn't one specifically, but it was a specific type of failure. It's a drill pipe failure in which the tube broke, leaving it completely parted. And so what was happening though is, okay, so when you're drilling, you have fluid that's going down the center of this drill pipe, which they call the drill string, and then it's also coming up around it. So not only does that bring your cuttings up, allowing you to clear the way for the hole as you're drilling, but it provides lubrication and cools your equipment. So when you lose circulation, you no longer are cooling that point of the pipe that if you have that pack off. So it's rubbing against these open wells, it's rubbing against casing, and it is getting extraordinarily hot. And that changes the metallurgical structure of the pipe because there's a lot that goes into it. I mean, this stuff is heat treated, and engineers do in-depth investigations as to what is the proper heat treat and everything. So when you start applying this amount of heat to it downhole, it's uncontrolled. And what happens is it changes that structure and it turns it extremely brittle and it just parts. And it was pretty difficult to discover what had happened in the beginning. Once we started realizing, okay, this is what's
Absolutely.
happening.
I mean, and that's, for the average person,
still
thinking about the
rotating
metal
while you're
structure
packed
actually
off, and
changing,
that's creating this heat, it's
that's
breaking off.
mind-blowing.
So it was a
Something
really
definitely-
fun investigation for me, as well as some
You have
of
some
the
experience
project
working
engineers
as
that
an
were
operations
involved in it.
supervisor in Permian. Other than really hot, can you tell us what that was like? What was it like in Midland during the boom times?
That is. Well, I unfortunately didn't really get there during the boom time. I did work as a third party and second party during the boom time out there, but as an operations supervisor in the Permian, I mean, it's a pretty fun experience. Yeah, it's extremely hot, but the amount of activity out there and the amount of folks out there is awesome. Um, I mean, you just go into a store, you go into a restaurant, and you can meet some very phenomenal, smart people and get some stories. So that was one of my best parts about it. Is all the people out there, but it's very active. I mean, you are always going, and it's it almost a little intimidating in that sense. But 16-hour days are very common. The networking and the connections there in Midland. I mean, like you said, outside of it being hot, I mean, there's just so many people out there. There's so much activity that you have plenty to do. And I mean, you go out to eat and you can run into some really wonderful people who've got a wealth of knowledge. And, so one of the things I enjoyed doing was, finding somebody that maybe I hadn't seen in a while, or, hey, I know this
Absolutely,
guy.
yeah. I
We
don't know
worked
that
on a
there's many
project
other
together.
places
I'm
that
gonna
you
go
can
buy him
find a
beer,
concentration of
just go
people
pick his
that
brain.
are so
And
knowledgeable
so that was
about oil
one
and
of
gas. And
the greatest
something Matt
things
and I
I
have talked
thought
about, and I've heard
about
many
Midland,
times
the
from people in the
opportunity
mineral
to
rights world,
connect
is
with some really
they're a little
awesome people.
hesitant to go into Texas because some of the individuals know more about minerals than they feel like they might. So to kind of sum up the safety, to sum it up for our listeners, like myself, I didn't realize just how big of a role quality plays into getting the wells to production from start to finish, not only for tool failures, but also for safety. And as an analogy, failure in the field can result in an investigation similar to what the NTSB does with a plane crash. They're looking at the why, how to prevent it from occurring again, and ensuring that everything is going smoothly. Is that a pretty good way to sum it up, Joey? Do you think that conveys it pretty well?
That is a very good way to put it up. There's
And
just so much
one
that
last
goes
question
into
here:
it,
who
from
are these people doing it?
manufacturing,
Is it
of the
everybody
equipment
is trained
years
with a
before
level
the
of
well
quality
even is
mindset,
conceived
or are
to
there special
finishing
people
the
out in the
well.
field
There's a
who
lot
it
that
is their
goes into
job
it.
to
That's a
ensure the
great way to put
safety
it.
and the quality of what's occurring?
There really is. There's a team of people out there. They're usually designated folks that are the quality mindset and have the quality initiative and are out there really enforcing the quality requirements. But there's still a level of quality that everybody has inherently, intuitively, right? Everybody wants to do a good job, so they want to follow the procedures that they know. But it really does. It boils down to a group of people out there with the mindset of knowing, like, look, if we do this right, we can do it well, and we can do it at minimal cost as well, whether that's financial cost or safety cost.
Yeah, and safety is a big deal too. I know that's, usually one of the first things that the operator talks about when they look at performance. And if something happens and somebody gets hurt, then even if that well was done on time and under budget, then that's a failure. So I know that's a huge component of it too, because at the end of the day, especially the guys in the field, they just want to go to work, do a good job, and then go home safely to their families. And that was, I remember, the big focus when I had, kind of an operations support role and was working in the field. It was, 100% on we're going to do it safely or we're not going to do it at all because it's just not worth the cost, especially in the oil field. It's just the costs from a human life and environmental perspective are just too big. So yeah, just before we wrap up, anything either of you would like to talk about before we wrap up?
I got one thing. It's kind of right on the cusp what you were just talking about with safety. I know that I've seen so many times where the safety world and the quality world wind up being these separated silos of knowledge. And I think that's oftentimes a mistake because the type of thinking, the type of folks that identify the most safe operations for this process, the best ways to avoid these dangers, to avoid these risks, to mitigate these risks, that's the same type of process that goes along with, well, how do we ensure that we're operating cost effectively here? How do we ensure that we're doing this with the minimal downtime? It's the same thought process, but from, again, two different angles. And so, for anyone that has the opportunity to just cross the line for a minute and go have a conversation, kind of like what Joe was just talking about, go get a beer with the safety guy. As goofy as that sounds, right? But no, go talk. You'll learn a little bit about what they're doing, and vice versa, because you're using the same processes, the same patterns of thought to solve two ends of the same problem. And what you find is that good quality processes oftentimes create safer work environments. Like we were talking about the metallurgy earlier. If you've got this corroded, degraded pipe, it's a lot more likely to have ruptures and cracks and problems that then create more hazardous environments that someone else has to go in and try to fix. And I think we would all agree that the fewer man hours that are clocked is the least amount of risk for some of the operations to some degree. So yeah, definitely try to not let these two worlds be their own independent silos of knowledge.
No, that's a great point. And maybe to bring it home for people, You have some really cool content that I've seen on your podcast and your YouTube channel. An example, grilling, right? So you talked about grilling quality management.
Yep.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And this is kind of off topic, but maybe just to, again, wrap it up and bring it all home for people.
Sure. Yeah. So I love to cook on the grill. It's nothing to spend 12 hours, smoking something. And everyone tells you this is the secret and that's the secret. And okay, fine. Those are all valuable. The rub's important, but if it doesn't, marinate long enough, it doesn't matter. Maybe it's a dry rub or a wet rub. Well, depending on the type of meat. So there's so many factors and variables that go into this. And so, this is honestly the truth with so much of the work that we do is you really have to sit down and identify what are all of the factors and variables we got here. So for grilling, you got the rub, you got the meat quality. Is it dry? Is it wet? Are you marinating it? How long are you cooking it? What temperature are you cooking at? For meat, this is something important to know. A salty meat, the water in it boils around 230 degrees. So if you're smoking it, and you're sitting there close to that 230 degree mark, you can be pretty sure you're going to wind up with something really dry and nasty when you're done. But the point is, you got to take all of these variables into consideration and create a plan. And that's true on the grill for the holiday, and that is true on the rig, is you got to know all of these different variables and factors and come up with a good plan.
That's a great point, and I think that wraps it up well. And before we sign off, where can our listeners go to find out more about Texas Quality Assurance and the products and services that you guys offer?
Yeah, so go to texasqa.com. You could spell it all out, texasqualityassurance.com, but that's a lot of extra typing that most people don't tend to want to do. You can find the podcast just anywhere you listen to podcast. Just look for Quality Matters. You can hit us up on LinkedIn. If you are looking for any products or services, that is going to be Joey's specialty. He is what we call our QMS guide, and he will guide you that entire process, whether you're just getting starting with quality management or you just need to get someone in there to perform your regular annual audit. He's going to be the guy to check it out. And so you want to make sure to find him. And you can just go to LinkedIn and just type in Joey Falbo and you'll find him there.
Sounds good. Well, thanks again, guys, for coming on the show and educating us on the importance of quality management and really how it affects us in our day-to-day lives, not just in the oil and gas industry and, when we're drilling a well, but just in, everything we do. And so
Thanks
I know
so
I'm going to be a
listening
little
to the
bit
Mineral
more
Rights
cognizant or
Podcast with
aware
your
of
host,
the
Matt
quality
Sands.
element
Don't forget to
when I'm looking
subscribe
buy
and
a
share at
product or service.
mineralrightspodcast.com. The
Appreciate
Mineral
your
Rights
time.
Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice.
you.
All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However,
thank
we
you,
make
Matt.
no
Thank you, Justin.
representation as to its completeness or accuracy.